I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler on this week's episode. The injury bug bites the Gators again. Will has a toss-up article, another one here on the way. This time he zeroes in on the Florida State Seminoles, and we will save the back half of the show this week for our thoughts on Swamp Kings from Netflix that just dropped. Will and I have been watching that the last couple nights here, and so we got plenty of thoughts. So we both finished the series, and we'll let you know what we think. But Will, we got plenty to get to, so let's dive right in here. More tough news out of camp for the Gators. I know we opened the show last week talking about Justice Boone. This week we're talking about running back Cam Carroll, the 6 foot, 231-pound wrecking ball of a running back out of Tulane. Was expected to contribute behind Johnson and Etienne in the backfield this season. Look, we talked about in the preseason magazine, Will, the Gators have 103 carries to give away with the departure of Anthony Richardson. This was a guy that we definitely expected to have some level of contribution this season. And to even with Etienne and Johnson, he was going to find a role on the field. So we obviously wish Carroll a speedy recovery. And while on the surface, you can look at the team and be like, well, your third string running back, you can handle it. But really what this does, Will, is it takes a room that I think most of us felt great about in terms of giving it a grade. I think I had it rated an A or even A plus in the magazine because you're pretty much 4 deep with Carroll here. And now you're reliant all of a sudden on Trayon Webb to step up. And it's not that I'm not confident in Trayon Webb's ability. I think the guy's going to be a great player, but you're putting a true freshman in a spot that's requiring him to contribute his freshman year, and really not much of a backup plan. Just it exposes the depth, Will, and we saw the same thing along the defensive front. Some of these talented freshmen will get the opportunity to contribute on the defensive front as well with the injury to Boone. But man, we don't have much room for error after these depth pieces are stepping in here, Will.
Well, I mean, welcome to the 2023 Gators. I think that's really sort of what this points out, and really why we've been harping on recruiting for as long as we have. I think one of the places you're really going to see this is perhaps special teams, because Trevor Etienne was an awesome kick returner last year. They've had him doing kick returns during fall camp. I'm not sure you can use him to get that edge
That's a good
and
point.
risk him getting injured when you've only got Montrell Johnson and Etienne in the backfield, right? Because if Etienne gets injured, now all of a sudden you're absolutely reliant on Trayon Webb. Like, you're not just like, oh, well, we'll get him in there, get his feet wet for 5 or 6 carries, and we won't put him in critical situations when we need pass protection. Like, at that point, you're going to have to rely on him extensively. And so I think one of the first places that this really hurts the Gators is just on special teams, because Etienne made a huge difference in terms of flipping field position last year. And I think you can envision that happening again. You mentioned the 103 carries that Anthony Richardson had last year that Cam Carroll was going to come in and replace. Look, when Naquan Wright went down last year, or not when he went down, when they decided to demote him to third string, Johnson and Etienne got the bulk of the carries. I think they'll be able to do that again. Again, you're just now skirting right on that razor's edge of Webb being a major contributor. The other thing you might see is somebody like Eugene Wilson being put into the backfield a little bit more as well. Not necessarily as a runner, though maybe as a runner, but just as someone who's going to be executing the offense from in the backfield when there's a passing situation or a time when they want to get the ball to somebody out into space. They might end up bringing some other guys into the backfield. And then you got to have some tight ends step up, right? So Arlis Boardingham, Hayden Hanson, Tony Livingston, most of the time last year they were 3 wide, one running back. I know they've been running a lot of 2 running back sets in spring and fall camp. Well, now that you're down to 2 proven running backs with a true freshman back there in Webb, are you going to start going back to more of those multiple tight end sets and essentially having an H back there rather than 2 running backs? Those will all be sort of the questions that we're gonna see. But look, there's no doubt that when you looked at the offense, tight end, we're sort of like, I don't know what we're getting. Wide receiver, you're like Pearsall, and then I don't know what we're getting. And running back, you were like, I know what we're getting. And Carroll is like major insurance for the guys who are already there, who we know what we're getting. Well, the insurance policy just went down, so there's no insurance. You're skirting that edge, and look, I mean, obviously, like you said, we wish Carroll well, and this is just part of it, right? Running backs have ACL injuries. That's football players have ACL injuries. That's just something that sort of happens. And, non-contact injuries happen. It stinks, but, if this had happened in week 1, I think we all would have been like, okay, at least it happened during a game. That's the thing that makes it worse, right? Is that it happens during practice before you actually see the guy play a game. So you don't really know what you're missing. You don't really know how the chess pieces fit together. And so it's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. But again, I sort of go back to special teams as the place where I immediately go, this probably has an impact, just because I don't think that you can, I don't think you can risk it.
I don't mean to be the guy that's constantly being a bummer on the transfer portal every show, it feels like now, Will. But another example of someone out of the portal that transfers in that, we see Goodwin transferred home, obviously had a situation in the family. It's not going to be playing for the Gators this year. Carroll did come off of injuries. He did have some injuries at Tulane. He was very good when he played, but he had some injuries throughout his career at Tulane. And that's maybe one of the reasons why a guy like that jumps from Tulane, who, by the way, is projected to be a very solid team again this year, makes that jump to the SEC to maybe get some greater exposure, you would think, to do that. So, I mean, I'm really bummed out for Cam Carroll is not getting the opportunity. But once again, when we go into the offseason, we talk about portal. I just don't think that's the answer for anything other than a plug and play here and there, Will. And
Well, I mean,
piece.
so I think that's the thing, is that you're going to have guys who are hit and miss, and in this case, Carroll is injured, but that's not abnormal for football, right? People get injured, but Florida needed depth at the running back position. There's no doubt, and so if they had just had Johnson, Etienne, and Webb, and somebody had gone down, well, now you're really thin. So Carroll was a depth piece overall. He was a luxury for Florida to bring in, right? And the other thing is Carroll's not dead. He's going to be back next year, right? So from the standpoint of sort of Montrell Johnson is probably a guy that you think of, at least coming into this year, might declare for the NFL draft when he's done, if he can do everything that we think if he does everything we think he's going to do. And ETN is a guy who's going to be coming into that season next year where he's sort of in that same spot. Carroll is going to be a solid backup player. And then you've got Webb coming in, who's going to be coming into a sophomore season. So if you look at it again as a building opportunity, Webb is going to get some carries this year he wouldn't have gotten otherwise. That's probably good for 2024 and 2025, which, let's be honest, that's really what you're building for if you're Billy Napier. Like, you want to win games this year. You want to be successful. You want to start laying that foundation for 6 and 7 is not acceptable, and we have to get better. Absolutely, no doubt. But you also need to get a lot of these young guys playing time, and that's going to, Trayon Webb is going to be forced in there early just because of the Carroll injury. Just the way it is.
Well, speaking of the transfer portal, Will, Florida State, the Florida State roster. Let's talk about the toss-up series you're doing and talk about those FSU Seminoles. What you see in this toss-up matchup with Florida this year.
And so it's interesting. I mean, clearly they have an advantage at quarterback, right, with Jordan Travis. But it's the last game of the year that Florida's going to be playing them. And when you looked at Florida State, there were two things that really jumped out to me. They feasted on teams with losing records. They were 6-0 against teams with losing records, but they also played 6 one-score games. And they were 4-2 in those one-score games. That tends not to last. You tend to go 3-3 if you've got 6. But what we've actually seen over the last few years with both Jim McElwain and Dan Mullen is that the number of ones, at least this is what I'm starting to draw from those eras, is that the number of one-score games that you play is actually a bigger indicator of your talent level than your record in them, right? So Jim McElwain went 6-1 in his first 2 years in one-score games. Jim McElwain went 7-1. Dan Mullen went 6-1, and that bolstered their first 2 seasons, and they were able to sort of paper over some of the deficiencies in their roster. And then in either the third or the fourth year for each of them, it fell apart. And all of a sudden we're staring at 4-7 seasons and 6-7 seasons and that sort of stuff. And so what it suggests to me, the fact, and if you look back at Alabama and Georgia and the way they built their first year, Kirby and Nick both played a lot of one-score games. And then in the second year, it was like one-score game for both of those guys in their second season. So that's one thing to look for from the Florida side, because they played quite a few one-score games last year, but also Florida State has been sitting right on the edge. They haven't recruited well at all. They're like ranked 21st overall over the last 4 seasons. And so what they've had to do is they've had to paper over those holes through the transfer portal. So they've got Jeremiah Byers coming in at right tackle. He got major playing time at UTEP last year. They got Casey Roddick at left guard, major playing time at Colorado over the past few seasons. But They were 84th in tackles for loss allowed last year. Florida had 7 tackles for loss versus FSU. They only had 70 all year. They also had 2 sacks, and they only had 23 all year. So they were in the back. And I mean, my enduring memory of the Florida State game is 9 defenders converging on Jordan Travis and him escaping. And
Just
so
all
Florida,
over the field.
so Florida State's season is really going to come down to, can Jordan Travis stay healthy? And one really interesting thing that I found is when you look in the one-score games, he ran the ball way more than in the games that they played against those teams with the losing records. And you'd sort of expect that, right? You got to actually like pull out all the stops when you play teams that are better and that sort of stuff. But he was a lot less effective through the air. He only completed 59% of his passes, and then he completed 70% in the blowouts. He ran for 6.2 yards per rush in the one-score games and 3.2 yards per rush in the blowouts. And so what that really suggests to me is, and if you go back and look at FPI or just the 24/7 composite rankings for talent, the teams that they played the one-score games in were teams that were of equivalent talent to them. So they're a team that is going to have a decent season because they're going to play a bunch of teams in the ACC that have less talent than they do. But the question I have is, with a rebuild offensive line, with transfers who are coming in, you already mentioned when it came to Carroll, and we've seen it with some other guys that you did a great job in the magazine of pointing out sort of, you end up like maybe 1 out of 3 guys turn into like a real solid starter. And Florida, I think, we all look at Mazuka and go, oh, he's going to be great because Osiris Torrance was great last year. But that doesn't always happen. And we saw that on the defensive line with Dan Mullen, right? Adam Schuler comes in and plays really, really well as an effective cog for Dan Mullen to start things. And then they bring in Truesdell and Daquan Newkirk and Antonio Valentino. And it's sort of, there's just not really much contribution overall. So that to me is why this is a toss-up. I think if Jordan Travis makes it to that game, then Florida's going to have a really rough time. But I'm not sure Jordan Travis is going to make it to that game healthy. I think they're going to, when they play Clemson and when they play LSU and when they play some of the better teams on their schedule, Travis is going to run because he's going to have to run in order to be effective, in order to help Florida State move the ball. I think they're going to lose those games, but 2, I think that there's a possibility that 12 games in, he's going to be incredibly beat up behind an offensive line that doesn't help his running game very much, and then having to run against better teams or teams that have similar talent. Florida has very similar talent to Florida State. The one advantage Florida State has is the quarterback position. So if I'm picking that one as a toss-up, if I'm saying what gives me hope coming into the season, it's that you're going to get a banged up Jordan Travis. You get an offensive line that can't block a Florida defense. It's really starting to get its legs. And you're getting a Florida State team that quite honestly barely held on at home last year against a very flawed Florida team. And now hopefully you've got a Florida team that's taken major steps forward. And we'll see. Maybe we'll have a different quarterback for Florida at that point as well. But that to me is the thing, is I think clearly everybody looks at Florida State. They're already ranked as like a top 10 team coming into the season. Oh, the Noles are going to be great. They don't have a profile of a team that was like top 20 or top 10. Like they have a profile of a team that's probably like top 25.
On paper, though, you look at what they did, the progress they made on offense last year was quite impressive. They bring in Coleman out of Michigan State. They bring in Jaheim Bell, who's talented. I don't know if his stat sheet matches his talent level, but the tight end out of South Carolina. And Benson comes back. And we saw what Benson could do. We saw what that running back can do. So they certainly seem like they have the pieces to have a pretty explosive offense here. And it seems like they're lining up to have the best season they've had with Norvell on paper.
So I think the hype. So I think one of the things that we always overlook is that success is not linear. We'll talk about this with Swamp Kings a little bit, I'm sure, but it's not like Urban Meyer came in and went 5-7 his first year and 10-3 in his second year and then won a national championship in his third. That's not how it works, right? Like the progress is not linear. The fact that Jordan Travis had an awesome season, like they got Tate Rodemaker behind him, and if all of a sudden you got Rodemaker in there having to play major snaps, I think the whole complexion of that team is different. Like that team does not go 10-3 without Jordan Travis at quarterback. If they have Jordan Travis from 2 years ago at quarterback, they're probably 6-6, right? And that game, and it's not that long ago that we watched probably the worst Florida State game I've ever seen, in the game where their kicker whiffed on the onside kick at the end of the game. Like
we had some bad ones during the McElwain.
Well, that's true, but again, I go back. But you know what I mean? Like you go back, you don't have to go back that many games to where Florida State was a laughing stock. And so Travis took a major step forward last year. There's no doubt if a healthy Travis is playing in that game, I think that Florida State is going to be favored. I'm just not sure he's going to be able to stay healthy. I think that a lot of their success was a mirage going 4-2 in the one score games and having 6 games against teams that just weren't very good from a talent perspective and from an FPI perspective. And so if you start a season 6-0, like that kind of just based on your schedule, well, that kind of makes the season look more successful than it is. I think they're on a razor's edge in terms of being able to win. Does that mean I think they'll have more wins than Florida at the end of the year? Yeah, I think they will. I think they're a top 25 team. I don't think they're a top 5 team. And I think that's sort of the distinction, right? Is if you look like the Wisconsins of the world and you the Michigan States of the world and the Marylands of the world and even like the Mississippi States and the Mississippis, like those teams sort of go in and out of the top 25, and on any Saturday they can be beat. That's what I think Florida State is. I think that they are a team that's going to kind of go in and out of the top 25 after they get blasted by LSU in the first week. And, that it's going to be, it's going to be one of those things where, we sort of look at it at the end and go, they were a borderline top 25 team, 8-4, 9-3, somewhere in that range. I would be very surprised if they went 11-1, 12-0.
So you got FSU getting blasted by LSU the first week?
Yeah.
It'll be interesting. We'll see. I despise that game is in Orlando. Man, I really do. That game should have been a home and home. The LSU Florida State should have been a home and home.
Harold Perkins is gonna go nuts. He is gonna go nuts, and I'm gonna cry while he's doing it. But yeah, I am seriously
that one
worried
still
for
burns
Jordan.
you, huh?
I am worried for Jordan Travis's health with Harold Perkins. He might be the best defensive player in the country, and I think he's going to show it when they play Florida State.
I think you're being a little tough on the Knowles here. We'll see. We'll see.
Maybe true, man. But that's what I'm here for.
We'll see how it is. We'll see how it is. If you have not watched Swamp Kings yet and you want to see it fresh, there are going to be spoilers ahead. Spoiler alert ahead. We will be talking about the details of different episodes. So if you want to watch this after you watch the documentary, feel free to tune in then. But spoiler alerts ahead. All right, let's talk about the Swamp King. Speaking of tough on the Knowles, we'll talk about Swamp Kings.
It wasn't tough on the Knowles. They never mentioned them.
Yeah, they did mention a few things. We'll get to that at the same time. But overall thoughts. Let's really start with what stood out to you. What'd you like, right? So just a quick summary for those of you who haven't seen it. It's a 4-part documentary. It really kept the focus on the key moments of the 2005-2009 Gators in terms of just diving into the games. It kind of reminded me of now that's what I call Gators 2006 old CD. Well, just kind of the greatest hits, right? You played the greatest hits, but it was fun. It was a really fun watch. You enjoyed. They did a great job recreating significant on the field moments. And for those of you that listen to our show weekly, that was one of the big concerns I had going into it, is whether or not they would keep the focus on the field. And I think they did a great job of that. The behind the scenes tapes, the midnight workouts, the mat drills, practice, like Meyer in practice, especially the locker room footage really added a great backdrop to the story. The B-roll shots at campus were great. The downtown Gainesville, I loved all that. Brandon Seiler, though, this guy, outstanding storyteller. I remember him as a hell of a linebacker, and now I'm going to remember him as a hell of a storyteller. And if UF stocks some Seiler jerseys this year in the gift shop, I think there'll be some 40s floating around the swamp this fall here. You had Tebow, Meyer, Spikes, and the rest of the cast, a few other guys, Major Wright, Ahmad Black, Tate Casey, to name a few. They covered a lot of ground, but I'll say this, Will. We just wrote that. I was just holding this up here for the show here. We wrote a magazine from scratch this year, right? We wrote a magazine from scratch. When you tell a story from scratch, you have to narrow it down. Yeah, it's difficult. It's more difficult than you think just to parse it down and tell a part of a story. I think these teams were so interesting that even though there were significant pieces left out, which we can get into, I do think that they picked a lane and they stayed in the lane. They stayed in some particular lanes on that. But my last thought here is I also really enjoyed Tim Tebow's Jim Caviezel whisper impression throughout most of the storytelling. I love Tim Tebow. That's about as deep as I'll go to criticize Tim Tebow ever. But dude, Tim, you're on TV every week, man. We know what you sound like. The whisper, like, I don't know. I thought the whisper thing was cracking me up the whole time. Like, we know how you typically sound. We know what your voice sounds like. I'm not sure why he was whispering the whole time. So, like I said, did this cover every angle of the story? Absolutely not. But it did a great job of getting the participants in the storytelling, their perspective, and bringing the moment to life. So I think that I was personally reminded of how much on the edge those games were in some of those seasons. And they didn't even go all the way into those stories. They talked about the timeouts against Arkansas in that 2006 SEC championship and then the punt. But, Wandy Pierre-Louis jumps on a loose ball in the end zone. Well, they couldn't go into everything. I get it. There's a limited amount of time, and they still had 4 pieces. But overall, that's my high-level impression of things I liked from the documentary. What did you like about it?
Yeah, man, I think the thing I enjoyed the most was the Brandon Seiler, like you already mentioned. I think that was stuff I didn't know, right? Like I had never
you didn't know
heard.
about his parents?
Well, the fact that he wound up like
Story.
laughing his butt off at Urban Meyer going, those are the craziest damn parents I've ever seen. Like, you go be crazy. That's fine. I understand. Like, but I mean, beyond that, I don't know. Like, we never got to know Brandon Seiler during his time there. Like, you knew of him as a football player, but you didn't know of him as a personality. And by the time you got to the 2007 and 2008 seasons when Seiler had left, well, now these were people we were all familiar with. I think this was an awesome infomercial for the University of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Like any recruit who watches this will be like, that's cool. I'll give them another look. Anybody who wants to know about the history. I mean, look, 2005 was 18 years ago. Right. So the kids who are being recruited nowadays know nothing about the Urban Meyer era. They know of him as a weirdo who kicked a kicker at Jacksonville and got fired. They don't know him as the head. If nothing else, they maybe remember him as the head coach at Ohio State who got pushed out after scandals there. So I think this was a good reminder of what Florida could be. And so look, from the standpoint of the university comes off looking great in the documentary. I think Brandon Seiler is the main winner, like you mentioned. I think Tebow's whisper was a little bit weird, but that's all right. And I thought it was really interesting to see the evolution of Brandon Spikes, right? That he was very self-aware that he came in there and was lazy and just wanted to play football. And that the difference between 2007 and 2008 for Brandon Spikes was that even though he hated lifting weights, he got in the weight room and was the leader for that team. And you think about that defense and how porous they were against Michigan in the bowl game in 2007.
Right.
And then in 2008, how good they were to have to shut down that Oklahoma offense to finish off the year. I think that it was an interesting ride to go relive it and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that was missing. I think there's a lot of criticisms you can make about the documentary. I'm sure we will do that. And some of it I think is personal taste, and some of it I think is more thoughts on what a documentary is supposed to be. But in terms of like, am I ready for the season after watching that documentary? Heck yeah, I'm ready for the season.
Well,
like, let's kick the ball off.
I had goosebumps reliving some of these moments. I was at a significant portion of these games. Like I was at the Auburn loss in 06. I was at the LSU. Well, maybe I was a jinx on the road. I don't know. I was at the LSU game in 07 where Tebow's dialing the phone in the end zone. I got to see a lot of this live. It was awesome. I really enjoyed my time in college there, getting to relive this stuff here. But what was one moment that you went back to? For me, it was the 06 Tennessee game. I do remember that being a dogfight, but I didn't quite remember just how close it was. I remember it went down to the wire in the fourth quarter, but that 4th and 1 with Tebow, that crossing pattern there to Dallas Baker to get in the end zone, the 1-point win. Those Tennessee games, for those of you who are younger and don't remember how good Florida and Tennessee was throughout the 90s into the early 2000s, you got to keep in mind, Tennessee, we were having some issues with them. We were dominating them throughout the 90s, but that little early 2000s blip was Zook. they had the Hail Mary before halftime on one of those games in the swamp, and they came in after the 9/11 game that got bumped back to the end of the year, and they ruined a national championship. Was it Spurrier's last game in the swamp, actually, where they end up coming in there and stealing the SEC East out from under us, and a potential BCS championship bid. That was pretty rough. So we had a couple games that weren't awesome throughout that stretch. And so that was Florida really reestablishing itself, its 90s dominance in the Tennessee rivalry, which we've enjoyed, for the better part of the last 15 plus years here, Will. But that '06 Tennessee game really stood out to me on the road in Rocky Top, especially with Tebow being so green still. So what game really stood out to you that you didn't remember as well as you thought you did?
I mean, I would say the Arkansas game is the one where I conflate the punt that Pierre Louis, the muffed punt that Pierre Louis recovers,
Mm-hmm.
to the fake punt.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I forget that Harvin then just put on the afterburners after that fake punt and converted that converted that drive. Cause that's the thing, is they were still at like their own 30 after the fake punt. So I had remembered, I realized that Urban Meyer had taken a risk. I realized that they had recovered a muffed punt, but I didn't, for some reason I didn't remember those as separate events. So it was kind of interesting to go back. Like you mentioned, they didn't even show the muffed punt that Pierre Louis recovered, but they showed the fake punt and the process of that and that sort of stuff. And I also didn't remember Arkansas being that competitive in that game. Right. Arkansas came out in the second half and hit them in the mouth and took a lead. And then Florida had to go back the other direction and take it back. And they were able to do that. So that was something I hadn't necessarily remembered.
That's how it was that season, though. There was a lot of close games that season where they just kind of kept getting by. And that's why they talk about the disrespect going into the Ohio State game. Ohio State was a juggernaut that year in offense. They were putting up crazy numbers on offense. Troy Smith was the Heisman winner. And for that '06 team to go into that national championship game and not just pull the upset, but dominate really both national title games, Will, the '06 title and the '08 title game, those offenses, if you go back and watch the '08 Oklahoma Sooners offense, that they were scoring over 60 in a lot of games. They were insane. Sam Bradford won the Heisman that year. Troy Smith wins the Heisman that year too. And they just shut down both of those killer offenses in such huge moments. And really, you got to appreciate what you lived through in those times, Will. Those were some great times, and really brought back great memories for people that are old enough like us to remember it. But for the younger generation, I'm not sure how much they really appreciate. They see those numbers on the wall, those '06, '08. I'm not sure how much they really appreciated how of how good Florida was during that stretch.
Yeah, I mean, look, we had a weird situation where my father was living in Gainesville, my mom was living in Fort Myers, as my sister finished up high school, and so one of the things that I would do is go down to Gainesville to visit, just to hang out with my pops, right? And all of a sudden now we're watching the games and we've got something to do, and these games are going on. So I associate these seasons with going to visit my dad and hanging out. And that's really when we started going to games. And now we go to at least one game every year where it's me, my dad, my brother, and maybe some other people. So, the Auburn game where they had the field goal in what was that, 2007, where Auburn kicks a walk-off field goal there at the Swamp. That was one that I was at too. So, there's always been, you've got those memories where you were actually at the game, and it's cool to sort of relive those the whole way through. So, for kids who haven't experienced that yet, that is the reason to be patient. That is the reason when you get a 6 and 7 season to say, I'm not jumping ship. I'm going to stay through this and see it all the way through, because of how special it is when finally you get one of these big time seasons. To be honest, we saw that with Georgia a couple of years ago. I have one friend who's a Georgia fan. I had to text him congrats afterwards and then throw up emojis. But that dude was walking on cloud nine for a week and a half, and the reason is because of the drought since 1980. And I guarantee you now you're going to see a lot of people at Georgia who complain when they struggle this year in a few games. And it's going to be a lot like that '09 season that they talked about in the documentary. So, they're sort of on the back end, hopefully, of their little jaunt here. And hopefully Florida's going to be looking up with Napier. But it just makes me appreciate those moments. And, one thing that they absolutely didn't have time to address, but is critical really to me to understanding that time frame, is that the basketball team was winning national championships
That
too.
wasn't even mentioned.
And,
Yeah,
and so
yeah,
you're sitting there like an experience as a Florida fan within that time frame was so freaking amazing.
right,
And so it wasn't just, like this would be like think about if Georgia won a national title in basketball right
right.
now. You'd just be sitting there going, God, I hate Georgia. Like they win everything. And all my friends, I was at Virginia Tech for the '08 title. Actually, I think for the '06 title as well. I'm at Virginia Tech at that point. And all my friends at Tech are just like, shut up. Like, we don't want to hear about it. Like, every time you turn around, Florida's beating UCLA or Ohio State in the national championship. Oh, Florida's beating Ohio State for football in the national championship. And it was just that way the whole way through. And so it was a special time. And that was what this brought back. This brought back that special time aspect of things where you start thinking about where was I, what was I doing, where was I in my life and
Right.
those sorts of things. And so from the standpoint of a Florida fan, I think this was a really successful documentary, especially somebody who lived through it. From the standpoint of the Florida program, I think this is an awesome ad for the university
Yeah.
in terms of what you really get if you bring Florida back to prominence. So in those two cases, I think the documentary did a really good job.
It also made me remember how much I really love UCLA because of what UCLA contributed to our national championship runs during that era. In basketball, we just smoked them every time we played them. And then they did us the favor of beating USC in that 2006. That same day they're playing USC in that we were playing the SEC championship game in 06. And they pulled a crazy, I think it was Maurice Jones-Drew. They pulled the upset. And I remember flipping back and forth on that at halftime, going, "Oh, they're gonna do it. We got a shot. We got a shot." So UCLA, man, shout out to UCLA. But Will, obviously, it's 2023. There's gonna be criticism everywhere, all the time about everything. But I did want to start off with the good because overall, I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed the documentary. I thought they did. I thought it was a fun thing that kept the focus on football. Really enjoyed the storytelling. Uh, there were a lot of questions about missing characters who are definitely compelling aspects of these stories. I'm not sure if Chris Leak was just an inconvenient dude that stood in the way of Tebow's greatness. Like that's kind of the way he was portrayed in the story a little bit. Not so much the starter for the national championship team that really had a good attitude. Nowadays Chris Leak comes in, he might be a dude on the transfer portal market in 2 seconds, right? Like, but he stuck it out through a tough time at Florida.
That
He
was
didn't,
something that they didn't address at all, was the
yeah,
amount of sacrifice that Chris Leak had to make in order to step aside. I mean, they did mention that when they would bring Tebow out and bring Leak in, that some of the fans would boo. And I remember him having to deal with that and the
yeah,
questions that
that's
came up all the time. And you got guys like Colin Cowherd wondering out loud, should Tebow be getting more run and all that sort of stuff. And the fan base obviously loving Tebow, and for great reason, right? Tebow was a major contributor to that team and was sort of a signal that Urban Meyer was here and that there was a new sheriff in town. So the amount of sacrifice, the amount of pressure on a guy like Chris Leak, and they didn't address that at all. And I think there are some off-field things for Leak since he's left Florida that maybe make that a little bit difficult to do for something like this. But just to ask guys like Tebow, like what was it like in the quarterback room with the switching in and out, to ask Urban Meyer, did you worry about the fact that you were bringing in Tebow and was it going to disrupt what Chris Leak was doing? How did you manage that? How did you break it to them? Like, what were their responses? Was he mad? Was he just like, okay, whatever you got to do, coach? Like, you've got two of the three principals in that entire thing, right? You got Meyer and Tebow that you can interview for it. I'm not sure why they never addressed it, because I just look at that and go, like, Chris Leak was a major part of what the team was able to
The guy
accomplish.
started from his freshman year. He had a lengthy career. That doesn't happen very often in the history of Florida football. So he
Well,
definitely has a significant place. Chris Leak has a significant place in the story of the history of Florida football. And I know Tim Tebow's Tim Tebow, but it shouldn't take away from Chris Leak's story. I think he's got an awesome story. He was very much a part of that transition that helped springboard. You hear these new coaches talk all the time. Be a part of the change. Be a part of the change. Chris Leak really embraced that. The system did not fit him perfectly, and yet he found a way to be enough of a ball player to get it done and help lead the Gators to obviously great players all around them. But that's the University of Florida. You're always going to have the great players there. He got it done, and he's a national championship quarterback.
Well, it was the most egregious miss in the entire documentary. They spent a lot of time talking about Spurrier and Urban Meyer in the cock block game. What they didn't mention was the two major runs that Chris Leak made in that game to keep drives alive that allowed Florida to take the lead before Jarvis Moss made those blocks. And you think about like narrative storytelling and those sorts of things. Like the story was that Tebow was the perfect quarterback for the system and Leak was a square peg in a round hole. And then when it really came to like the critical game, when they needed a play from Chris Leak, he didn't make the plays with his arm. He made the plays with his legs, scrambled twice to keep drives alive that kept Florida in the national championship race. So again, this guy who's a square peg in a round hole is doing the square peg things or doing the round hole things, right? He's forcing himself into the system to make it work. Tebow isn't the guy who had, I think it was like a 13 or 14-yard run for a first down on their game-winning touchdown drive that Leak wound up doing. I want to even say it was a designed run. I can't remember. I'd have to go back and look. But Leak made major plays with his legs in that game. And so just from a storytelling perspective, I look at it and go, what were you thinking when he ran off and did that, when he set that up? What was the emotion that Leak had set up this game-winning, the game-winning drive? I mean, look, the block from Jarvis Moss, all that sort of stuff, they didn't even get into the blocked extra point that kept it 17-16 as opposed to 17-17, right? So, again, I get it. It's 3 hours. You're trying to go over a 4-year period. But I also, that to me is one of the main weaknesses in the documentary is I feel like there was a lot of stuff in there that they treated with a surface because they were going over 4 years. And I think there would have been an opportunity to focus in more.
He was a guy that was a big part of those first couple of years with Urban. And he was also a guy you felt really good for when they got it done in 2006. And I always remember the picture of him holding the trophy up. And again, Tebow was the backup to Leak when he first came in. And Tebow was a great role player, absolutely made a difference in 2006, but Leak was that starter. He was that starter, and they didn't really play up his role much at all. Another major miss, in my opinion, Percy Harvin. Did I even hear his name until like maybe they were like, oh yeah, and by the way, Percy's injured for the Alabama game. I'm like, the whole time, I'm like, where's Percy? Where's Percy? Where's Percy? I keep asking. Where's Percy? I know they talked about it a little bit. I'm being a little facetious here, Will, but
I was texting you after the third episode going, have you gotten here yet? Like, did Harvin exist? Because he was the best player on
all
the
those
06,
teams,
07, and 08 team.
Right. The best player. And like, love Tebow. Tebow is a legend at this school. Harvin is still probably the most talented player I've seen in a Gator jersey. That guy, it was a different level of football player.
It's not a coincidence that they struggled to move the ball much more in 2009 when Percy Harvin wasn't on the team. I think if Percy Harvin had stayed, and there's no reason he was going to stay, but I think if he'd have stayed in 09, Florida probably beats Alabama, or at least plays much more competitively in that SEC championship game. The fact that he was missing in the SEC championship game, that the game I think wound up like 31-21, something like that. But it was a slog the whole way through, and Tebow had to make some plays, but they did not have the explosiveness. And you just, again, the Arkansas game, when he was in that one, they get the fake punt and all of a sudden off he goes. Right. And the fact that guy, I mean, his freshman year, I think he had 35 catches and 41 rushes, and they would put him in the backfield, just hand him the ball, and he'd run like a counter and off he'd go.
It was like the Wildcat era, right? They would just go Wildcat with Percy, and he'd just take it off for 30 yards.
He was the best player on those teams. The fact that, one, he wasn't interviewed was staggering, but maybe he just didn't agree to it. But the second part is, the fact that they didn't go get those guys' opinions of what Harvin brought to the team, I think was something that I'm just like, you can't tell this story without Percy Harvin. And they tried to, especially for the first 3 episodes, and I think they missed out big time by not doing it.
And we could go on. We could name countless players here, but significant ones: Pouncey brothers, Reggie Nelson, Cam Newton. For a minute, it's an interesting story. Riley Cooper, Lewis Murphy. I mean, you could probably go and name a lot of different players there, Will. But and even some of the guys that were just great along that defensive front. There were a lot of great players across the board for those Gator teams that you could have talked about, and it really kept the focus. But again, I do empathize with the fact that it's a 4-part docuseries. You have to cover a ton of ground. And actually, the director, Catherine English, she was interviewed on Feinbaum recently. So if anybody wants to check that out, it's on his Apple Podcast feed. Catherine English talking about Swamp Kings here. She says first, she is British, and she says I heard I first heard of this story 2 years ago, is how she opened up the interview. I first heard of this story 2 years ago. I'll admit, at one point she also says, I'll admit I don't know much about American football, if anything, when I heard about it. But she did talk about how interesting the story was once she started diving into it. She's been directing films for 20 years, so a ton of experience in how to do so, how to tell a story. I'm not trying to be disparaging at all when I bring that up. And it is so much. It's like if I told you to go through and read all about the 1965 through 68, the Steve Spurrier years, and tell me the perfect story about that. You might miss a few key points in there too. And if you got Tebow, you got Spikes, you got Meyer, I can understand maybe parsing it down and drilling it down and just telling those parts of the story. But I also think it's credit to these teams with how interesting this group was from top to bottom, that you could sit there and tell a 4-part series, Will, and we look at it as Gator fans go, plenty of meat left on that bone still. You can still tell. You could do another 4-part series on these teams. That's how interesting they were.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was clear that, I saw the same thing, but I saw an interview on Outkick where she said, I'm not somebody immersed in the world of American football. That was pretty clear, right? That the subjects of the documentary drove the topics, not the football games.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, one of the things I thought they didn't spend any time on that they really should have were the timeouts at the end of the Georgia game. Like, I want to know what Urban Meyer's thinking while he's calling those timeouts. And they didn't even address it. Now they addressed Spikes coming in and just absolutely tattooing No-Show Marino.
Yeah.
Right. But the thing is like, then you're left. If you didn't know anything about this program, you didn't know anything about those teams, you leave thinking Florida played a clean, hard game, and they showed great sportsmanship all the way through, even though they whipped them, and they hate Georgia, but they went out and showed it on the field. Not that Urban Meyer is a vindictive SOB who called timeouts at the end to stick it to the Bulldogs at the end. But that, to me, again,
that wasn't even enough. We should have been throwing it deep. Spurrier would have thrown it deep.
Absolutely. But this, so, see, that's the thing, is that this turned into a human interest documentary on Tebow and Spikes and Seiler, and very much in particular Urban Meyer.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to make it that, then you have to have the vindictive streak that Meyer has come out. And there were a few places where they brought that in, where he talked about, I treat my stars like stars and my shit like shit. And if you want to be treated like a star, you better start playing like one. Like, but that attitude. And the interesting thing for me is, I always think about this. I read an autobiography, or not an autobiography, a biography on the Patriots by Seth Wickersham on Brady and Belichick. And one of the takeaways I had from that was, I left that book going, was it worth it? Like, they don't have any close friends, or at least Belichick doesn't have any close friends. He's burned a bunch of close relationships because of football. He just seems like a miserable dude who's everything is focused on football. And look, he gets all sorts of adulation from people who don't care about him, but it doesn't feel like he gets a lot of adulation from people who do care about him. And the question I keep asking is, was it worth it? So one of the things I would have liked to have seen is Shelley Meyer come in and ask her about Urban Meyer popping Ambien to go to sleep, her worries as his weight was dropping, her interaction with the players and the disciplinary struggles that they got into a little bit. What was her opinion when it came to Urban and what he was doing with the different players, and how they got into the story of Avery Atkins and his drug overdose after he was dismissed from the team. Little bit of a misleading story there in terms of Atkins, but they got into it. And what I wanted to know is, how did that impact Meyer and the people around him, not just Meyer's opinion on Atkins? So to me, they threw a lot of different topics in this thing. And there were some spaces where I felt like they could have said, look, we're trying to tell a story about Urban. Like, to me, the first episode was a story about Brandon Seiler. And that first episode is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And then 2, 3, and 4 deviated from that. They had like 3 was supposed to be the disciplinary thing where they talked about it being Gaines Vegas and the University of Florida controlling that space. And so, you're not going to arrest players and things like that. But to me, if you're going to do that, that is an Urban Meyer episode. So you make that the Meyer episode, and then you have a Tebow episode, then you have a Spikes episode, and that's fine. It didn't feel like to me they sort of separated it that way. I thought there was an opportunity to do that, and they didn't do that. And obviously people are going to criticize, and we have to bring up that both Tony Joyner and Aaron Hernandez are convicted murderers, and both of them were on these teams. Joyner was on the 06 team, and then Hernandez was on the 08 team. You start talking about disciplinary problems, how Urban Meyer specifically said, they weren't going to abandon any kids after the stuff with Avery Atkins. Like, again, I don't think you have to get into that to tell this story.
Yeah.
But I think once you go to the disciplinary place, you kind of have to tell bits and pieces of that story, because I look at it
if it's relevant to the time, and this was one of my concerns going in. If it's relevant to the time in question, bring it up. But I thought that it was not something that again, what Aaron Hernandez eventually did. How did that really have? What did that have to do with him playing for Urban Meyer?
Well, but it had a ton. No. So if my kid, who I'm raising right now, ends up in prison for armed robbery, one of the things I'm going to do is look back at the disciplinary track that I took with him.
You're a kid, though. You're not. That's not a kid. What about a kid?
Urban Meyer specifically
you coach a 10-year-old team. What if a kid who's 10 years old does something stupid on prom night 8 years from now? Is that on you?
Well, so look, Urban Meyer specifically.
It's a little silly how we talk about these things with coaches.
No. I don't think it is. I don't think it is at all.
Massive influence over these guys, where some of them go, "Okay, coach, whatever."
Meyer made it a point in the documentary. If Meyer doesn't say what he says about Atkins, which is basically that I resolved right then and there that we were never going to abandon a kid, it meant that there was never any, we're going to kick somebody off the team for disciplinary reasons as a threat for anything. And I'm not saying that Hernandez and Joyner would have wound up perfect in that case. I have no idea. Perhaps he had no impact, but I wondered it. I sat there and I said, did these guys who essentially had their problems when they did things out in Gainesville, and their problems went away because they specifically talked about problems just going away, that there were fixers who would come in and solve their problems. Yep. They brought that up, and then they just went up, now back to the football. And I was like, well, that's weird. The criticism isn't that they didn't bring it up. The criticism is you brought up the first part and you didn't bring up the second. And I would have just preferred they either completely ignore the subject completely and make it a football documentary, or you tell the entire story. Because they only told half the story, it felt like an incomplete story. And then that took away from all the other things they could have shown on the football field, right? You could have shown Leak's runs. You could have shown more about the Leak-Tebow relationship. You could have shown Urban's timeouts versus Georgia. You could have shown the fact that he was dominating the team out west, and that it was frustrating for Seminoles fans that he was just and that they were beating Miami as well. Like, there were opportunities to tell a football story that were missed because they decided to get into the disciplinary stuff. And then the other thing is they use the disciplinary stuff to sell the documentary, right? Like, all that you saw were clips about, oh yeah, it was Gaines Vegas, oh it was crazy, all that sort of stuff.
And then Brandon James is the highlight for buying a little weed. He's the highlight of the criminal cases there.
So I mean, again, I don't mind them ignoring it. I don't mind them getting in depth with it. What I minded was that they tried to split the baby, and I just don't think it worked. So I think you spent a half hour doing something that was non-value add, and you could have put a half hour of football in there. If you're going to make it a football doc, and you're going to and look, from everything that we've heard from the director, Catherine English, and from other people, is that these interviews weren't going to happen if they made it all about Hernandez and Joyner and discipline and stuff like that.
Right.
So just ignore it. Just say, look, this is part of the story. You can get that story other places. This is about the personalities and the people on the field and Florida and what they did. And I think it's just as interesting, except I think it's maybe even more in depth.
And I will say this. I don't know if there's any way to talk about this that you're not going to divide the room in some way. I think you bring that up. You dive into that. Some people could completely disagree with what I'm saying. I look at it this way. Urban Meyer I'm not even sure. Does he know every name on the roster? Does he know the guy, every single name on the roster coaches? You would think, but you hear stories about college coaches, right? They don't they don't know every single guy walking around that hallway in some programs, guys. And it's a big program at Florida, and it's sitting there like to pretend like he's got this outsized influence. I mean, Brandon Spikes, they were talking about Gaines Vegas, right? All the parties. See that was it Silent or Spikes? Hey, you living right? You living right? That's about the extent of it right there. That Spike story. Hey, Spikes, you living right? And he's like, no, I'm not living right. I'm a college kid. I'm not living right at all. And so we talk about this, but it's this old school mentality from like the college All-American, student athletes. Like we didn't hear stories about anybody's studies or student athlete. That's like kind of like an old thing that's attached to college sports a little bit. And it's sad. It's sad a little bit that but it's just I don't know. I call BS on that stuff, and I do think that I'm not trying to diminish anything. Obviously, what happened with Hernandez is extremely serious, but you could tie it a lot more to what happened. We've watched those documentaries, right? We've read those articles. We've seen a lot about Aaron Hernandez.
Yeah.
You tie it back to his childhood. You tie it back to a lot of things about. There's a lot of things that goes into a person's psyche that builds into that, and like. Hey, did maybe you could say there's a missed thing here or there at the University of Florida? Sure,
Well,
sure.
and I don't even know that you need to go that
I don't think
far. Other than
it's a big part of the story if you're telling the story of those teams, though. That's
well,
what I'm saying on that.
well, and in some ways I agree with that. Except you're telling the story. It became a story about Urban Meyer over the course of the 4 episodes,
And that was a
and
criticism I heard online. Do you think
and
that it was trying to rehab his image too? Like,
absolutely it was.
yeah,
Because otherwise you ask the question after he goes through and says we were never going to abandon a kid. The next logical question is, do you think that had anything to do with the things that have followed some of your players as they've left? Right. And you don't even have to say Hernandez and Joyner. You just have to say, do you think, looking back, do you think that was the appropriate policy considering what's happened in the future? Because you're looking in the past saying, I'm going to adjust my approach in the future because of what just happened. But in making that adjustment, did that affect anything in the future? That question would have completely closed the loop for me, and I would have been okay with it. But when you decided to shy away from it, it became clear that it was Urban Meyer's attempt to explain why discipline ran wild in the program. And the problem is that we've got anybody who knows football a little bit and has followed Ohio State at all as well, saw some of those things follow him when he went to Columbus as well. So yes, it was an image rehab thing. I saw plenty of people saying it's time to get him, it's time to get him in get him in the Florida Hall of Fame or whatever. Like basically it's time to bring him back and forgive him for anything that he did over the course of the time he was there in Gainesville. And maybe I think that's a good discussion to have. I just don't think this is a complete discussion when you're really talking about why people have mixed feelings about Urban Meyer. And again, I understand why it was shied away from, but if you're going to shy away from it, then like I didn't learn anything from the section that talked about, things going nuts in Gainesville that I didn't expect. I expect a couple of guys, hell, Steve Spurrier used to talk about wanting to play Georgia early because he knew they were going to have a couple of guys out, right? Like that probably would have been a joke for these teams as well. But I mean, is that really outside of the norm? No. The things that were outside of the norm was how much it proliferated and sort of the approach to the discipline. I think that was the first time a lot of people had heard about attorneys who were fixers and those sorts of things. And if you're going to go through that, you got to tell the whole story. That's my only thing is tell the whole story or don't tell it, because there was enough football stuff that was missed that to me there were areas that felt incomplete in multiple spaces and just yeah.
So what? Another fascinating point. I remember. I forget where I saw this, but it was I believe it was a Saban speech somewhere. Forget where he's giving it, but he was talking about one of his points was high achievers don't get along with mediocre people, and mediocre people don't tend to get along with high achievers. Yo, Urban Meyer, you can have any opinion you want of this guy. This guy is a high achiever. This guy is an absolute freak about winning. And I remember when the Jags hired him, I might be the only Jags fan that doesn't have any ill will toward Urban Meyer because, I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio. coached the Buckeyes, coached the Gators, like went to Florida while I was there. I love Urban Meyer, man. I'm a big Urban Meyer fan. But the dedication to winning is almost unmatched with this guy to an unhealthy degree. And I thought some of that was interesting. They barely touched the surface of it. I know he talked about the Ambien, that he talked a little bit about that. But when you're building a program to get to that level, and you see what Saban has done in the proof of concept of a level of sustainability that can't occur with that, where Meyer went and he can burn real hot and fizzle at Ohio State. They're the same, almost the exact same pattern at Ohio State. Is very similar. What do you think we can learn from that going forward? Because even Spurrier, why did Spurrier leave for the NFL? One of the reasons was he was just, hey guys, 10 wins isn't good for you anymore? Like, was that part of the reason that he was out there saying that? So it's like a program like Florida that's just going to demand. And you got here like respected writers like Stuart Mandel of the Athletics out there predicting Billy Napier is going to get fired this season. Which, come on, man. Oh, those Florida boosters are going to come up with that $32 million buyout. Sure. Okay. But
would have rather spent it on Rashada.
Right. We spent it there, we would have to fire you, dude. But if you're looking at it from like a standpoint of sustainability, what can we learn from the Urban Meyer era coming forward? And I feel like Billy Napier really brings the aspect of Saban that he brings, is he just that process oriented. It strikes me as a more sustainable model. I'm hoping it has that level of success. There's almost to reach the Meyer level of success. That's really hard, going to be really hard to do. But if Billy Napier does hit, it just feels like it's a more sustainable model overall. And what lessons would you take from that Urban Meyer story?
Well, I mean, not just lessons for the football program, but I think lessons for life, which is that you need to, that if you look at the guys who've been long-term successful in college football, guys like Bobby Bowden, guys like Tom Osborne, guys like Joe Paterno, those guys I think loved the process more than they loved the winning. Now, they still wanted to win, but they love the process. So Nick Saban loves the process, right? Like he quoted, he's trademarked that, the process. But what that really means is he's much more research and development oriented. And I come from an R&D world. I'm a scientist.
You also live in Philadelphia, and you're just giving the process all the credit to Saban.
Well, something like that.
But it's not like the Sixers too much.
Well, no, not at all. But my point is that they love the process, and the result is wins and losses. And if you do the process right, the result is going to be a lot of wins. Mm-hmm. Urban Meyer loved the winning, which meant that he did the process, right? Like he was texting guys in a locked room after winning the 2008 championship, texting recruits, because he hated losing so much and loved winning so much, he was willing to do that stuff on the backside, right? And that to me, I think is the thing. And when you say Napier is more sustainable, what you're really saying is he's not psychotic, and or at least he's psychotic about the right things, right? That you're incredibly cognizant of the way you do something in March is going to reflect what you see on the field in August and September and October, and that you're not just going to be able to adjust stuff in October if you didn't do the right things in March and April and May. And look, Urban Meyer knew that, but I almost feel like Meyer in some ways, like the whole Spikes arc, where he comes in, he's like, I just want to play football, man. I just want to play football.
We're not trading for Iraq here.
Cool. And then eventually he goes, I know I hate this, but I'm going to do it because it's necessary to win. Mm-hmm. That is the Urban Meyer attitude, right? Where I hate this, but I'm going to do it to win. Whereas the Seiler attitude was, kill me, coach. I love this stuff. Like, you put me in the weight room and I am going to be a monster. And Tebow was like that too, right? He's sitting there next to Seiler, going in there and saying, if he does one more curl, I'm going to do two. If he does one more squat, I'm going to do two. And sort of the idea that, you love the pain and you love the prep and you love the process versus loving the result. Now, you love the result too, but you recognize that your love of the process, you hear this all the time for professional athletes. It's not that they don't want to play on game day anymore. It's that they don't want to put in the work that's necessary in order to make sure they're ready for game day. Like that's when guys tend to know that they retire. And that's why Brady lasted till he was 45 years old, because he loved that prep work and was willing to do it. And dude hasn't had a strawberry in like 2 decades. And that sort of process, like I guarantee you Brady is somebody who loves the process of preparing as opposed to just loving the result on game day. And Meyer, I mean, hell, the stories during there where he's like about to throw up on the sidelines when something happens, like Seiler after the kickoff
So
return
good.
from in the Ohio State game by
Yep.
Ted Ginn, like Seiler has to go in and go, dude, calm down. Like,
Pick up
what the
your
hell's wrong with
headphones.
you? Like, pick up your headphones. Like, he's like, Herb was over there freaking out. I had to go calm him down. Like, if you're going to calm down your head coach after the first play of the game, granted a bad play, but if you're going to calm him down, like, to me, that just sort of represents something that's unhealthy to start with. And look, a high achiever, absolutely. But and this is where I go to what I said earlier about, is it worth it, right? There is no doubt that Urban Meyer is an awesome college football coach. The question I have is from a relationship perspective and from a quality of life perspective and all those sorts of things. Like, was it worth it? Right? Like when he dies and people get up at his funeral, are they going to say the things that he wants them to say, or are they going to get up there and go, I hated that guy and I was a better football player because of it, but I despised him. Right. And look, I think there's going to be varying opinions across the board on Urban Meyer, um, but I think that's sort of when you start looking at things through the framework of, when I die, if I was sitting in the back, if my soul is like floating above the room and I get to see what people say at my funeral, what do I want them to say? And those are the questions I wanted asked, right? Like, those are the things I wanted to learn about Urban Meyer. I'm not sure that we necessarily got all the way to there.
Well, and that's where, so coming almost full circle here, I think this ended up being a solid. It was a solid look at a very specific slice of these teams, and I think you can say, yeah, I wish we went deeper on things, but they did cut. They covered so much ground in really a relatively, even though it's 4 episodes. Well, what was the total runtime there? 3 hours.
Three
We're
hours, yeah.
saying so. It's 3 hours of runtime. I'll tell you what, as someone who's tried to learn to develop content himself, you can go way over real quick. It can happen. So it's hard to make those decisions on what to cut and what not to cut. But I hope we certainly didn't cover every aspect of it in our own discussion here. Will we have to
No,
pick
in
and choose
fact,
what we're talking about?
the one thing I was about to say is the thing I found most interesting about the documentary was they are still bitter and angry that they didn't get the 2009 championship. Like,
Don't you love that a little bit? They cared, man. That team was it. That team was invested.
yeah, but you think about a guy a decade later or 15 years later or whatever it is, getting interviewed about, 2 national championships and a Heisman Trophy and all that
Right.
stuff.
That was epic.
You almost feel, or I almost felt like Tebow would trade every single accolade he had for that '09 championship. And it's fascinating to me, and I think is representative of why, one, those teams were so good and those players were so good, is that they didn't, like, the '06 championship. Okay, that's great. Time to win another one. Right. Like, and losing '07 burns at him. Losing '09 burns at him. And, that's one of the things. Like, Tiger Woods was like that too, right? Like, he come in second. Everybody's like, oh, that's great. He's like, second sucks. Like, those sorts of people. Again, I think there's a trade-off when you're that type of person. But I think, you know, Urban Meyer, we've seen a lot of his flaws, and part of that's because he's been the head man in these instances. Tebow is not that different. Like, there's obviously the faith component and those sorts of things, but from a personality perspective, he's not much different. Like, that fire
They clicked.
burns there,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's interesting. I know Gator Dave had something up on Twitter the other day, wondering what would have happened if Tebow had gone to Alabama, because then he's playing with Mike Shula,
Oh,
and Shula probably lasts through the Tebow era. But is Tebow going to fit in that offense? And then Cam Newton comes to Gainesville, and then what happens if Newton plays? Or does Urban not get Newton because he doesn't have the '06 class? Because Harvin kind of came with Tebow, like they were, in fact,
Spikes
at
did
the
too, right? Spike said he was going to go where Tebow went.
I think all those guys
Not
went.
in the documentary, but
So are all
another.
those guys going to Bama, and
Yeah,
then is Nick Saban spending one more year at Miami, and then all of a sudden, look, there's a job open in Gainesville. So it's again just
it's a great what if question because I grew up in Jacksonville and he went to Nice High School, and I do remember coming home. I was on winter break from UF, and I remember coming home. And my girlfriend at the time was like, "So wait, why are we like?" I was like, "I gotta be." It was like he was announcing at like 4 o'clock or something or 3 o'clock. We gotta be at the TV at 3 o'clock. We gotta figure this out. And she's like, "Why do we care?"
So it turns out we're talking about the mental health of Urban Meyer and Tebow, but you and I both have some skeletons in our closet as well. Coming home at 4 o'clock to see a 17-year-old announce where he's going to
You see
college.
this wall? Does this look like somebody that's totally mentally healthy? Like
Well,
I'm lucky my wife gave me a little section of the house to do this
I
stuff
say the
with, man.
Buccaneers helmet sort of gives it all away.
Yeah, it's tough, man. Hey, I'm a sicko. I watch a lot of Jags football too, and hell, the Gators haven't been a treat at all times in the last decade. They've been a little rough at times too, but hey, we you do it because you love it, and that's what I'll tell you this. Tebow's a guy. One of the reasons why I was a little bit on edge coming into this documentary. This team, this era has been just trashed in the last decade. Urban, like Spike, not necessarily Spikes, but Tebow. And Tebow, there's a lot of reasons why Tebow gets trashed, and I'm tired of it. They've had everyone's had their moment making fun of everything, trashing everything, and it's good. It's good to see these guys in a good light. It's good to see because that's how it was in the moment. You remember those teams were awesome. Those teams were a lot of fun to watch. And going into those games, those were some massive moments, and they came through. And it's like everything just went your way for a few years, and every ball bounced your way. Every little thing was working out. Urban blows 3 timeouts at the beginning of the Arkansas second half there, the SEC championship game. No problem. We figure it out. So it was a great era. That was a lot of fun, and I think that's the part the documentary got right. And hey man, again, hopefully this encourages more looks into those teams because I think there's definitely room for it.
Well, it sounds like you and I should make a documentary because
There you go.
clearly we need other people to critique our stuff because I'm sure we'd have some foibles as well. So yeah, I don't want this to come off as I didn't like it. I loved it. I
Yeah.
thought it was a great look. It took me back to that era. It took me back to time that I was spending with my family, with my dad in particular. And that's one of the things that college football I think does better than anything. Like NFL football does it a little bit, but there's not quite the connection. And my dad didn't go to Florida, but he took a job at the University of Florida right at the time that Urban Meyer was taking over. And so all of a sudden we had something in common. And for somebody who didn't necessarily always get along all that well with his pops, that was something that brought us together and still keeps us together every fall. And that's to me what college football means. So we can talk about the broader societal implications and would have liked to know more about Urban Meyer and all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, like seeing these guys who are all a part of my life and a big part of it, right? Because there is something about strutting around wearing your UF stuff. Like I'll wear it even when they go 6-7, but it's a lot of fun wearing it when you just won a national title, right? And these guys gave that to us, and so like I said, with the basketball stuff that was going on at the exact same time. There was never a better time to be a Gator, and in fact, my sister got better SAT scores than me and had a better grade point average and didn't get in because the enrollment had gone up so
Tough
much
school.
since then, and worked out well for her. But that it was just an awesome time to be a Gator, and if nothing else, like you said, the sort of Gainesville stock footage of the beer store and all that sort of stuff, and the different areas around campus sort of brought you back to when you were there, when you were a student, when you were heading in for games, that sort of stuff. So you go back now and everything's changed, and there's new buildings going up left and right and all that sort of stuff, and sometimes it feels like those sorts of things are passing you by. So this was a great opportunity to go back and look at that moment in time sort of frozen in a space where all of us, it was a really special thing to be a Gator.
Well, I have no doubt that I am at some point going to watch this entire series again before the Gators kick off next Thursday night against Utah. And maybe a good note to end this part of the discussion on would be a quote from Brandon Seiler's mother that hey, you come here to win SEC championships in the nationals. You come here to make the NFL and win a national championship. This ain't Utah. This ain't Utah. So that'd be a good little speech to give. Billy should steal that from Brandon Seiler's mom in the locker room. Hey, this
Brandon
ain't Utah,
Seiler's
guys.
mom needs to come give the pregame speech
Yeah.
before the game against Utah.
Just get her a few beers in the parking lot, man. That'd be good, dude. That'd be good. All right, let's wrap things up. Hey, before we do, Will, I would like to plug our good friend Gator Dave. Just launched a new website, right? GatorsBreakdown.com.
Yep.
So he's got the podcast. He's out there. You can't miss Gator Dave. He's out. He's everywhere. He's everywhere. So, but his website's up now, and he's actually writing articles and doing. He's got a whole thing cooking up there. So he's always great with promoting our stuff. I want to make sure we give him a shout out on GatorsBreakdown.com.
Yeah, he's an awesome friend. Obviously, I contribute over there, but it's nice to see him expanding and growing. It's always good to see good people, see their dreams grow and that sort of stuff. And I know Dave would love to do this full time. And honestly, with the amount of content he puts out, he already kind of does do it full time. But it's awesome to see somebody expand and especially somebody who's a good person. So I'm thrilled for him. And yeah, go over there and check out GatorsBreakdown.com for all the stuff Gators Breakdown related. And you'll find 3 videos up that you didn't even know existed yet because he's just putting up unbelievable amounts of content. And there are times where I look at him and just go, how did you already get that up? Like, did you know that this was happening? He's like, nah, I had to race home on my lunch break and record
it's really impressive. The speed at which he goes after. That's not our operation. That's not our operation at all. But I'm always very impressed with how quick Gator Dave's all over it. So make sure if you're not subscribed to Gators Breakdown, you obviously can catch Will over there too. But please check out his new website and obviously Gators Breakdown at a podcast near you. Well, the other thing too, we did put out a little bit of an addition to the magazine, about 10 pages. You had sent it out to people who got the magazine. Any comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's about 10 pages extra. There's a look at Austin Armstrong's defense. There's also a look at freshman wide receivers and how they typically perform, both very relevant topics to the Gators this year. It was something that sort of hit the cutting floor when we were putting the original magazine together, but I think you and I both looked at it and said, God, we really kind of want to answer these questions. So as a thank you to the people who bought it, we went ahead and sent it to you directly. If you haven't bought the preseason magazine yet, we don't have any hard copies left, but what we do have is a digital copy. If you buy the digital copy, you'll get the original magazine, and then you'll also get the additional 10 pages when you make that purchase. So if you go over to readingreaction.com/mag, that's readingreaction.com/MAG, you can pick it up. There's also going to be a little snippet in the article that you mentioned earlier about toss up for FSU. There'll be about half the article looking at Austin Armstrong's defense, and it'll fade out and it'll say, hey, buy it here. So if you want to get a little taste of what it is, go head over to readingreaction.com, click on the most recent article there, the toss up for Florida State, and below the Florida State article will be a little snippet of what we put in the magazine as extra content. And it's pretty representative of what the magazine is, right? Like we've got offensive breakdowns that have a very similar structure to what we're seeing in there. So anyway, check that out. We appreciate everybody supporting us. It's a week and a half till the season starts, but not too late. Some of you are going on vacation. Some of you, quite honestly, if you like the Swamp Kings documentary, sort of got you ready for the season, I think this is one of those other things that you're going to read some stuff and go, all right, yeah, I am more than anything, sort of bring your expectations in line with what you might see this year. Writing it actually made me feel more encouraged about the Florida season. You've been making fun of me, calling me optimistic Will for the past couple of weeks. And part of that is because I've been ripping on our opposition. But I think part of it is that, I think there are definitely holes for this team, but I think there are definitely areas that we're going to see some growth. And we tried to highlight those sorts of things in the magazine. So hopefully people enjoy it.
And I'm just trying to highlight you, Will. You being optimistic. That's all I'm trying to highlight over here. Come on. You hear about it enough when you're not optimistic. So you gotta get it highlighted a little bit when you are. So I'm just trying to show off your optimistic side to the audience as well. So everybody, this is the last time you have to hear our voice when there's not a game the following week. So this is the last non-game week episode of Stand Up and Holler. We'll see you next week for the Utah preview. I'm so excited that we finally get to do previews, Will, and you don't have to take us deep for topics in the season, Will. It's a little bit easier, so that'll be fun. We're ready to get in the groove. We're ready for football season. If you haven't watched Swamp Kings, be sure to check that out on Netflix. And for Will Miles, I'm Nick Knudsen. See y'all next week, and go Gators.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to Stand Up and Holler. If you're interested in more information from me and Nick, you can go over to readandreaction.com. You can like and subscribe our YouTube channel here at Read and Reaction, or you can go to patreon.com/readandreaction to support us, get extra information, and we do Ask Anythings over there every once in a while as well. So check us out. Thanks for listening.